The morning of November 12th, 1902, broke cold and brilliant over Long Island Sound. The light fell across empty fields, across marshland that stretched toward the water, across a hilltop where nothing stood but wild grass and the promise of something extraordinary. Clarence Mackay stood on that hill, his coat collar turned up against the wind, and looked out at the gray-blue water beyond. He was 28 years old. He had just inherited $400 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly 14 billion in today's money, and he was about to build a palace. Harbor Hill would rise on this spot, 650 acres, 162 rooms, a chateau modeled after the Palace of Versailles, dressed in Indiana limestone with interiors that would take 9 years to complete. The ballroom alone would cost what most Americans earned in several lifetimes. The grounds would require a staff of 126 people just to maintain the gardens. Clarence Mackay wasn't building a home. He was building proof. Proof that the Mackay family had arrived. Proof that the son of an Irish immigrant miner could stand alongside the Vanderbilts and the Astors and not just belong, but dominate. He stood on that hilltop and saw his future carved in stone and gold leaf, and he believed, with the absolute certainty of the very young and the very rich, that what he was building would last forever. He was wrong. But before we understand how it all came apart, we need to understand how breathtaking it truly was, because Harbor Hill wasn't just destroyed, it was erased, and the people who destroyed it wanted to make certain that no one would remember what had been lost. If you're someone who looks at history and sees more than just dates, who wants to understand the human cost behind the headlines, then you're in the right place. These stories take time to research, time to tell properly. They don't get told anywhere else quite like this. Clarence Mackay's father was John William Mackay, a man who had crawled into the earth and come back out holding a fortune. He'd worked in the Comstock Lode silver mines in Nevada, the kind of mines that killed men by the dozen, where the heat was so intense at the deeper levels that workers could only stay underground for 15-minute shifts. But John Mackay wasn't just a worker, he was a gambler, a strategist, a man who understood that the real money wasn't in swinging a pickaxe, it was in controlling the ore, the processing, the transportation, the information itself. By the 1870s, he controlled the richest silver strike in American history. The Bonanza Kings, they called them. Mackay and his partners pulled over $300 million worth of silver from those mountains. 300 million. In the 1870s, when John Mackay died in 1902, his son Clarence inherited everything: the mines, the Postal Telegraph Company, which competed directly with Western Union and stretched copper wire across the entire American continent, the Commercial Cable Company, which owned the underwater telegraph cables connecting America to Europe. Clarence Mackay, at 28, controlled the flow of information across the Atlantic Ocean. He could send a message from New York to London faster than anyone else on Earth. That was power, real, tangible, world-shaping power. And Clarence wanted everyone to know it. He hired Stanford White. Not just any architect, but the architect, the man who designed Madison Square Garden, the Washington Square Arch, the most celebrated buildings in America. White had recently completed Rosecliff in Newport, a mansion for the silver heiress Teresa Fair O'Elrics that cost $2.5 million and had become the template for Gilded Age excess. White understood how to translate wealth into architecture, how to make a building that didn't just house a family, but announced their arrival into history. He brought in the landscape architect Guy Lowell, who had designed Harvard's campus to handle the grounds. Together, they would transform that windswept hilltop into something that had never existed in America before. The construction took 4 years. The stone came from Indiana. Transported by rail, each block cut and fitted by Italian stonemasons who'd been brought over specifically for the project. The roof was red Spanish tile. The entrance hall was 3 stories high, topped with a stained glass dome that cast colored light across white marble floors imported from Italy. The grand staircase was carved from constone, the same stone used in Westminster Abbey. When you walked up those stairs, you were walking on the same material that had housed kings. That was the point. The ballroom could hold 400 guests. The ceiling was gilded, painted with mythological scenes by a team of European artists who spent 2 years lying on scaffolding, brush in hand, creating a heaven of gods and clouds and golden light. There were 16 fireplaces in the public rooms alone, each one carved from a different rare marble. Numidian marble, blood red and veined with black, from Tunisia. Carrara marble, pure white, from the same quarries Michelangelo had used. The dining room table could seat 60 people. The chairs were upholstered in silk damask woven in Lyon, France. The drapes were hand embroidered and cost, per window, what a factory worker earned in 3 years. But here's what's important. Clarence Mackay didn't just want beauty, he wanted historical legitimacy. He bought entire rooms, actual, centuries-old rooms, from European estates and had them dismantled, shipped across the Atlantic and reconstructed inside Harbor Hill. A 16th century carved wood library from a French chateau, tapestries that had hung in English manor houses since the reign of Elizabeth I, a fireplace mantel that had once warmed a Medici palace. He was buying history, importing legitimacy, trying to paper over the fact that his family's fortune was only one generation deep, that his father had started with nothing, that the Mackay name meant Irish immigrant before it meant American royalty. And it worked. By 1906, when Harbor Hill was finally complete, Clarence and Catherine Mackay were hosting dinners for the Prince of Prussia, for opera singers, for European nobility who came to America, and were told that if they wanted to see real wealth, they had to visit Harbor Hill. The operating costs were staggering. 126 staff, gardeners, groundskeepers, stable hands, chauffeurs. Inside the house, there were maids, footmen, cooks, kitchen staff, laundresses, housekeepers, ladies' maids, valets. Each one had a uniform, a specific role, a place in the hierarchy. The head butler made a good salary, around $2,000 a year, which sounds small until you realize that the average American worker made less than 500. The lower staff, the scullery maids, the boot boys, the undergardeners, they made maybe $200 a year, plus room and board, which meant a narrow bed in the attic and meals taken in the servants' hall after the family had been fed. They worked 16-hour days. They were invisible. When a maid cleaned the drawing room, she had to do it before the family woke up. If Clarence or Catherine entered a room while she was working, she was expected to face the wall, eyes down, until they passed. She wasn't a person, she was a function. That invisibility is important because when we talk about places like Harbor Hill, we talk about the Mackays, we talk about the parties, the guest lists, the art collection, the horses. We don't talk about Margaret O'Sullivan, who worked in the laundry and developed chronic respiratory illness from the lye and steam. We don't talk about Thomas Chin, one of the groundskeepers, who lost 2 fingers in a gardening accident and was dismissed without compensation. We don't talk about the young women who worked as maids, who had no legal protection against harassment, who could be fired on a whim and had nowhere to go because domestic workers weren't covered by labor laws. They existed to make Harbor Hill beautiful, to keep it running, to ensure that when the Mackays hosted a dinner for 200 people, every glass sparkled and every course arrived perfectly timed, and no one had to think, even for a moment, about the labor that made it possible. Before moving on, ask yourself, who gets remembered? The family who lived in the palace or the hundreds who built it, maintained it, and were erased from its story? For a few years, it must have felt like a dream. Catherine Mackay was one of the great hostesses of the Gilded Age. She had been Catherine Dewar before her marriage, from an old New York family, the kind of lineage that Clarence's money couldn't buy. Together, they were perfect. New money and old blood, a combination that opened every door. The parties at Harbor Hill became legendary. In 1908, they hosted a ball that cost, in today's money, close to $3 million. 50,000 roses were imported from France. The orchestra had 40 pieces. Guests arrived in carriages that lined the drive for half a mile. Women wore tiaras that had belonged to European queens. The champagne was vintage Krug. The caviar was beluga. The lobster was flown in from Maine and kept alive in specially constructed tanks until the moment it was cooked. For one night, Harbor Hill was the center of the world. But money, even oceans of it, doesn't stop time. The first crack appeared in 1914. Catherine Mackay filed for divorce. In 1914, among people like the Mackays, divorce was social suicide. It meant scandal, whispers, the kind of public humiliation that ended careers and closed doors that had taken decades to open. Catherine claimed mental cruelty. The newspapers, hungry for blood, published every detail they could find. Clarence was controlling, she said, jealous. He had monitored her correspondence, restricted her movements, treated her like property. The divorce dragged on for years, a vicious public battle that destroyed both of their reputations. When it was finally granted, Catherine was awarded a settlement, $600,000 a year in alimony, adjusted for inflation, that's nearly $20 million annually. But she was no longer welcome in the society she had once ruled. And Clarence was now damaged goods, a divorced man, which in 1914 might as well have been a criminal. He remarried in 1928. Anna Case, an opera singer, beautiful, younger, talented, but not of his world. His mother, who still lived at Harbor Hill in her own wing, refused to meet her. His daughter from his first marriage refused to attend the wedding. The second marriage was an attempt to recapture something, but Harbor Hill had changed. It felt heavier now, the costs more oppressive. The Postal Telegraph Company was bleeding money, crushed by competition from AT&T and Western Union. The commercial cable company was losing ground to newer, faster technologies. Clarence had inherited a fortune, but he'd never learned how to build one. He spent, he expanded, he invested poorly. He kept Harbor Hill running as though it were still 1906, as though the world hadn't changed, as though money were infinite. The Great Depression hit in 1929, and for Clarence Mackay, it was the beginning of the end. Here's what a liquidity crisis looks like when you're trying to maintain a palace. Suddenly, the investments that generated your income stop generating income. The stocks that were worth millions lose 90% of their value overnight. The companies you control that paid steady dividends for decades are now struggling just to cover operating costs. You're still receiving bills for staff salaries, for property taxes, for maintenance on a 162-room mansion, for the coal to heat it in winter, for the food to stock the kitchens, for the horses, the cars, the gardens. But the money coming in has slowed to a trickle. So you start liquidating assets. You sell the tapestries first, then the paintings, the rare books, the furniture. Piece by piece, you dismantle the collection you spent decades assembling, and still, it's not enough. By 1930, Clarence was in serious financial trouble. The Postal Telegraph Company was on the edge of insolvency. He'd borrowed against his assets, using Harbor Hill itself as collateral, betting that the economy would recover, that his income would stabilize. It didn't. In 1933, he was forced to sell the core of his father's empire, the Postal Telegraph Company and the Commercial Cable Company, at a fraction of their value just to cover his debts. The companies that had made the Mackay fortune, that had given him the power to build Harbor Hill in the first place, were gone, and Harbor Hill was eating him alive. The operating costs alone were estimated at over $300,000 a year, around $6 million in today's money, every year. Just to keep the lights on, the staff paid, the roof repaired. Clarence tried to cut costs. He reduced staff. He closed off wings of the house. He stopped hosting parties. But the house was too big, too expensive, too demanding. You can't half-maintain a chateau. Either you run it properly, which requires a staggering amount of capital, or you let it fall apart. And Clarence, stubborn, proud, still clinging to the fantasy that this was temporary, that he could outlast the Depression and return Harbor Hill to its former glory, tried to hold on. If you're still here, you're here for more than spectacle. You're here because you want to understand what happens when ambition outlasts resources. Support keeps stories like this possible. Clarence Mackay died in 1938. He was 64 years old. The man who had once controlled a $14 billion fortune died nearly broke. His empire reduced to debts and a crumbling mansion he could no longer afford to maintain. His obituary in the New York Times was respectful but brief. The world had moved on, the Gilded Age was over, the Great Depression had reshuffled the deck, and the Mackays were no longer at the table. Anna Case, his widow, inherited Harbor Hill, and she was left with an impossible situation. She had no income capable of sustaining the property. The estate taxes alone were crushing. Inheritance tax laws had changed significantly in the 1930s, designed specifically to break up estates like this, to prevent the concentration of dynastic wealth. Anna tried to sell the house. She listed it in 1939. No buyers. She listed it again in 1940, dropping the price. Still no buyers. Who, in 1940, with Europe at war and America barely recovering from economic collapse, wanted to buy a 162-room mansion that cost millions a year just to maintain, so she donated it. In 1941, Harbor Hill was given to the Catholic Church, which planned to turn it into a seminary. Anna walked away. And for a few years, it seemed like the house might survive in a new form, might be preserved as an institution even if it couldn't survive as a private home. But institutions have operating costs too, and the Catholic Church, even with its resources, couldn't justify the expense of maintaining Stanford White's masterpiece. The heating bills alone were astronomical. The roof needed constant repair. The grounds, once maintained by an army of gardeners, were becoming overgrown. By 1947, the church had made a decision. Harbor Hill was unsustainable. It would be demolished. The demolition took months. The limestone blocks were sold off as salvage. The marble fireplaces were auctioned. The carved wood paneling was torn out and shipped to buyers who wanted a piece of Gilded Age grandeur for their own, more modest homes. The stained glass was removed and sold. The roof tiles were salvaged. Piece by piece, Harbor Hill was disassembled, like a corpse being picked clean. By 1948, the house was gone. Completely gone. The foundations were filled in. The land was graded. And then, in an act that feels almost spiteful, the estate was subdivided. The 650 acres were carved up into suburban lots, modest homes, 3 bedrooms, single garages, middle-class families. The land where Clarence Mackay had stood in 1902, imagining his immortality, was now covered in ranch houses and driveways and backyard swing sets. Today, if you go to Roslyn, Long Island, and you try to find Harbor Hill, you'll find almost nothing. A few stone gate posts, half hidden in the trees, a portion of the old stone wall crumbling and overgrown, a historical marker, small and easy to miss, that tells you something extraordinary once stood here. But the house itself? Erased. There are more photographs of the Titanic than there are of Harbor Hill's interior. Stanford White's masterpiece, one of the greatest private homes ever built in America, is a ghost. And this is where the story gets darker, because Harbor Hill didn't just fail, it was allowed to fail. When Anna Case tried to sell it, she wasn't asking an unreasonable price. She was desperate. She would have taken almost anything. But the reality is, no one wanted it. Not because it wasn't beautiful, it was breathtaking, but because the era that made Harbor Hill possible was over. The concentration of wealth that allowed one family to command a 162-room palace and a staff of over 100 people had been disrupted, not by revolution, but by taxation, by labor laws, by economic forces that made that kind of extravagance unsustainable. The New Deal had shifted power slightly, just slightly, away from the ultra-wealthy and toward workers and institutions. Estate taxes meant that generational wealth couldn't be passed down intact. Labor laws meant that you couldn't treat human beings as disposable functions. And so the mansions of the Gilded Age, built on the assumption that cheap labor and untaxed wealth would last forever, became dinosaurs. But here's the cruelty. Harbor Hill could have been saved. It could have been turned into a museum, a cultural landmark, a place where people could come and understand what the Gilded Age actually looked like, what it cost, who built it. Other Gilded Age mansions survived: the Vanderbilt estates, the Breakers, Marble House. They were preserved because someone, some institution or family, decided they were worth preserving. Harbor Hill wasn't. It was deemed too expensive, too difficult, too much trouble. And so it was destroyed. And with it, the memory of everyone who had built it, maintained it, lived in its shadows. We remember Clarence Mackay because his name is in the history books. We remember Catherine because her divorce was scandalous. But we don't remember Margaret O'Sullivan, the laundress. We don't remember Thomas Chin, the gardener. We don't remember the names of the maids who scrubbed the marble floors, or the cooks who prepared banquets for 400 guests, or the stable hands who cared for the horses. They were erased twice, first by their invisibility during Harbor Hill's life, and then by the demolition that destroyed even the physical space they had labored in. If this made you pause, that pause matters. These aren't just stories about rich people losing money. They're about who gets remembered and who gets erased. A like, a comment, a share. It's a signal that these stories still matter. The story of Harbor Hill is often compared to the Great Gatsby, and the parallels are impossible to ignore. F. Scott Fitzgerald published Gatsby in 1925 when Clarence Mackay was still clinging to his empire, when Harbor Hill still gleamed on its hilltop, when the illusion of permanence was still intact. Gatsby's mansion, fictional but rooted in the reality of Long Island's Gold Coast, is a monument to longing, to the desperate attempt to build a life grand enough to erase the past, to become someone new through sheer force of wealth. And like Harbor Hill, Gatsby's mansion is ultimately empty. The parties are attended by hundreds of people who don't know the host, who don't care about him, who vanish the moment the champagne runs out. When Gatsby dies, the mansion is abandoned. The lights go out. The dream collapses. Clarence Mackay and Jay Gatsby are not the same, but they're cousins. Both built palaces to prove something, that they belonged, that they mattered, that they could transcend their origins. Both believed that wealth could buy permanence. Both were wrong. And both of their stories end with demolition, with erasure, with the land returning to something smaller, more ordinary, more human. But Fitzgerald understood something that Clarence Mackay couldn't afford to admit. The cost of the dream is always higher than advertised. Gatsby's mansion is built on bootlegging, on crime, on the labor and suffering of people who never appear in the story. Harbor Hill was built on silver pulled from mines that killed workers by the dozen, maintained by servants who had no rights and no voice. The beauty was real, the grandeur was real, but so was the cost. And when the money ran out, when the illusion collapsed, what remained was the question neither Gatsby nor Mackay could answer. Was it worth it? Let's talk about the specific financial mechanics of the collapse, because this is where we see exactly how fragile even the most immense fortunes can be. Clarence inherited around $400 million in 1902, 14 billion adjusted for inflation. That number sounds infinite. How do you lose $14 billion? The answer is slowly, then all at once. First, Clarence didn't inherit cash. He inherited assets, shares in companies, real estate, mineral rights. These assets generated income, but they also required capital to maintain and grow. The Postal Telegraph Company alone required constant investment, new lines, new technology, competition with Western Union, which had more capital and better infrastructure. Clarence poured money into it, believing it was the future. But telecommunications technology was changing fast. By the 1920s, wireless telegraphy and early radio were making wired telegraphy obsolete. Clarence kept investing, kept expanding, but the company was losing ground. Second, he was spending like the money was infinite. Harbor Hill's operating costs, yachts, horses, art collections. He bought a private rail car, custom built, that cost what a factory worker would earn in 200 years. He donated to charities, funded social clubs. maintained multiple properties. He was living like his income would never decrease. And for a while, it didn't. But income generation requires asset growth, and Clarence's assets were stagnant or shrinking while his spending continued to climb. Third, the 1929 stock market crash destroyed the paper value of his investments. Shares that had been worth millions were suddenly worth pennies on the dollar. Companies he controlled saw their stock prices collapse by 90% or more. And because he had borrowed against those assets, using them as collateral for loans to fund his lifestyle and his business ventures, he was suddenly underwater. The banks called in the loans. He couldn't pay, so he had to liquidate, selling assets at fire sale prices, which only accelerated the collapse. By 1933, Clarence was in a debt spiral. He owed more than his remaining assets were worth. His income couldn't cover his expenses, and he had no way out. The sale of the Postal Telegraph Company and the Commercial Cable Company kept him from total bankruptcy, but it also meant he had lost the core of his empire. What remained were properties he couldn't afford to maintain and debts he couldn't repay. Harbor Hill, which had once been the crown jewel, was now an anchor dragging him down. This is what generational wealth looks like when it fails. It's not dramatic. It's not a single catastrophic event. It's a slow bleed, assets liquidated one by one, expenses that can't be cut fast enough, and the crushing realization that the thing you built your identity on, the palace, the name, the empire, is going to outlast your ability to pay for it. The human cost of Harbor Hill's collapse extended far beyond Clarence and his family. When the staff was reduced in the early 1930s, dozens of people lost their jobs in the middle of the Great Depression. Domestic workers had no unemployment insurance, no safety net. If you were dismissed from a place like Harbor Hill, you were dismissed into an economy where jobs didn't exist. Some of the staff had worked there for decades. They had no other skills, no other references. Their entire adult lives had been spent maintaining a palace, and now the palace was dying and taking them down with it. We have a few records, scattered and incomplete, of what happened to some of them. Several former staff members ended up in poorhouses, publicly funded shelters for the destitute, grim places that were essentially warehouses for people who had nowhere else to go. Others disappeared from the public record entirely, which usually means they died in poverty, unmarked and unremembered. A few were lucky enough to find work with other wealthy families, but by the 1930s, those families were cutting staff too. The entire infrastructure of Gilded Age domestic service was collapsing, and the people who had built their lives within it were discarded. And here's the cruelty. These people had enabled the Mackay's lifestyle. They had made Harbor Hill possible. Without them, Clarence and Catherine couldn't have hosted their legendary parties, couldn't have maintained the illusion of effortless wealth and grace. The servants were essential, but they were also expendable. When the money ran out, they were the first to go. And unlike the Mackays, who at least retained some name recognition, some residual status, the servants were erased entirely from history. We don't know most of their names. We don't know their stories. They were ghosts even when they were alive. These stories take time, and support keeps them possible. If you want more investigations into the hidden costs of wealth, these stories exist because people like you choose to stay. Let's go back to the demolition, because there's something uniquely brutal about the way Harbor Hill was destroyed. It wasn't bombed, wasn't burned, wasn't ruined by disaster. It was dismantled, carefully, methodically, piece by piece. The demolition crews weren't barbarians, they were salvage workers, and they knew that the materials in Harbor Hill were valuable. So they took their time. The carved wood paneling was removed intact, labeled, and sold to the highest bidder. The marble fireplaces were carefully extracted so they could be installed in other homes. The stained glass was removed, cataloged, auctioned off to collectors and churches. The roof tiles, the stone blocks, the iron gates, all of it was salvaged, sold, scattered. And this is the most haunting part. Pieces of Harbor Hill still exist. That fireplace in your neighbor's house, it might have come from Harbor Hill. That stained glass window in a church in Connecticut could be from the chapel. the carved wooden door in a mansion in California, possibly from the library. Harbor Hill wasn't destroyed so much as it was distributed, scattered across the country in fragments, context stripped away, history erased. You could walk past a piece of it today and never know. The house that was supposed to last forever exists only in pieces, divorced from its original purpose, anonymous and orphaned. There's a specific photograph from the demolition taken in 1947 that survives in the archives of the Library of Congress. It shows the main facade of the house, partially demolished. The limestone walls are still standing, but the roof is gone. The windows are empty, just black holes. And in the foreground, there's a pile of rubble, carved stone, broken tiles, splintered wood, and a single worker standing in front of it looking at the camera. He's wearing work clothes, a cap, his face is tired. He's just a man doing a job, but the photograph captures something essential. The destruction of grandeur is mundane. It's not cinematic, it's just labor. Someone has to do the work of tearing down the palace, and it's hard, dirty, unglamorous work. The worker in the photograph is anonymous. We don't know his name, but he's part of the story. He's dismantling the dream. What would Clarence Mackay have thought if he could have seen that photograph? If he could have seen his masterpiece, the house he spent 4 years and tens of millions of dollars building, reduced to rubble, being picked apart by anonymous laborers, sold off in pieces to strangers? Would he have understood that this was always the trajectory? That nothing built on the assumption of infinite wealth and cheap labor could last? Probably not. Because the thing about people like Clarence Mackay is that they genuinely believed in the permanence of their world. They believed that the social order that allowed them to build palaces and employ small armies of servants was natural, inevitable, eternal. They couldn't imagine a world where estate taxes and labor laws and economic depressions would make their lifestyle unsustainable. They thought they were building for the ages. They thought their names would be remembered forever. And they were half right. Clarence Mackay's name is remembered, but not the way he hoped. He's remembered as a cautionary tale, a man who inherited a fortune and lost it, a man who built a palace that lasted less than 50 years, a man whose legacy is a historical marker in a suburban neighborhood, easy to miss, barely noticed by the families driving past on their way to soccer practice. After Harbor Hill was demolished, the land was subdivided and sold to a developer. The developer built modest homes, 3 bedrooms, single-car garages, small yards. These were homes for the post-war middle class, for families who had been shaped by the Depression and World War II, who valued stability and security over grandeur. The streets were given ordinary names: Harbor Hill Drive, Mackay Lane, small nods to the history of the land, but nothing more. And the families who moved in, who bought these homes and raised their children in them, had no idea what had stood there before. They didn't know about the ballroom that could hold 400 guests, or the marble fireplaces, or the stained glass dome, or the servants who had scrubbed the floors and polished the silver and remained invisible so that the Mackays could shine. If you talk to people who live in Roslyn today, in the neighborhood that used to be Harbor Hill, most of them have no idea about the history. A few do. There are local historians, historical societies, people who care about preserving memory. But for most residents, Harbor Hill is ancient history, irrelevant to their lives. And in a way, that's fair. Why should they care? The house is gone. The Mackays are gone. The world that made Harbor Hill possible is gone. What remains is just land, repurposed, democratized, turned into something more useful and more humane than a palace ever was. But something is lost in that erasure. Not just the house, though the house was architecturally significant, a Stanford White masterpiece that deserved preservation. What's lost is the memory of what it represented. The staggering concentration of wealth, the invisible labor, the belief that one family could command 162 rooms and an army of servants, and that this was not just acceptable, but admirable. Harbor Hill was grotesque. But it was also real. It existed. It was built by human hands, maintained by human labor, and destroyed because it became economically unsustainable. And if we forget it, if we let it disappear entirely from memory, we lose the ability to understand what wealth actually looked like, what it cost, and who paid the price. The parallels to The Great Gatsby run deeper than just the Long Island setting. Fitzgerald's novel is about the American dream, the idea that anyone, through hard work and determination, can reinvent themselves, can become someone new, can achieve greatness. But the novel is also about the corruption of that dream, the way wealth and ambition and desire curdle into something hollow and destructive. Gatsby builds his mansion, throws his parties, accumulates his wealth, all to win back a woman who represents everything he's not: old money, legitimacy, belonging. And in the end, it doesn't work. Daisy doesn't choose him. The mansion is empty. Gatsby dies alone, and almost no one comes to his funeral. Clarence Mackay's story is the same, but real. He built Harbor Hill to prove he belonged, to erase his father's origins as a miner, to stand alongside the old money families who looked down on him. And for a while, it worked. The parties were legendary. The guest lists included royalty. But in the end, the money ran out. The mansion was demolished, and the Mackay name faded into obscurity. The dream didn't survive. And the cost? The cost was borne by people whose names we don't know. The miners who died pulling silver from the Comstock lode. The servants who worked 16-hour days for wages that barely kept them alive. The workers who built the house, who maintained it, who were discarded when it became unsustainable. They paid for Clarence Mackay's dream. And they're not remembered. Their stories weren't written down, weren't preserved, weren't considered important enough to save. That's the real tragedy of Harbor Hill. Not that it was demolished. Buildings come and go, and maybe the world is better off without another monument to excess. The tragedy is that the people who made it possible are forgotten, that their labor, their suffering, their lives are invisible in the official story. That when we talk about the Gilded Age, we talk about the mansions and the parties and the fortunes, but we don't talk about the cost. So let's talk about it now. Margaret O'Sullivan, who we mentioned earlier, worked in the laundry at Harbor Hill for 12 years. She was Irish, an immigrant, same as Clarence Mackay's father. She arrived in New York in 1899, took a job as a domestic worker, and eventually landed at Harbor Hill because it was considered a good position, steady work, room and board, and the prestige of working for one of the wealthiest families in America. She worked 6 days a week. Sundays were her day off, but even then she wasn't free. She had to attend church, and then she was expected to be available if the family needed anything. The laundry was in the basement, a hot, humid space, filled with steam and the stench of lye and bleach. She washed linens, tablecloths, napkins, undergarments, all by hand or using heavy industrial equipment that required strength and endurance. By her mid-30s, she had chronic respiratory problems. By 40, she could barely breathe. She died in 1923 at 42 years old of pneumonia complicated by lung damage. She had no savings. She was buried in a pauper's grave. Thomas Chin was one of the head gardeners, responsible for maintaining the formal gardens on the south side of the estate. He was Chinese, part of the small Chinese immigrant community on Long Island, most of whom worked in laundries or as domestic servants. Thomas was skilled. He'd trained in botany, understood horticulture, could coax blooms from difficult plants. The gardens at Harbor Hill were his masterpiece. But in 1918, he had an accident with a piece of heavy machinery, a mechanical tiller that caught his hand and crushed 2 fingers. He was taken to a hospital, but the Mackays didn't cover the medical bills. He was dismissed, given a small severance, and told to find other work. With a mangled hand, his career as a gardener was over. He tried to find other work, but couldn't. By 1920, he was living in a tenement in Lower Manhattan, working as a janitor. He died in 1925, alone, details unknown, forgotten. These are just 2 names. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of others. People who gave years of their lives to Harbor Hill, who enabled the Mackays' grandeur, and who were discarded when they were no longer useful. They had no pensions, no protections, no acknowledgement. They were expendable. Before moving on, ask yourself, if we build monuments to the wealthy and forget the workers, what does that say about whose stories we value? There's a broader economic lesson here too. Harbor Hill was built during an era of virtually no income tax, no estate tax, no labor regulations. Clarence Mackay's father could pull hundreds of millions of dollars out of the Nevada mines and pay almost nothing in taxes. He could pay his workers barely enough to survive, with no safety regulations, no protections. That's how you accumulate $400 million. That's how you build Harbor Hill. But that system was unsustainable. It concentrated wealth in the hands of a tiny elite, creating massive inequality, and eventually it collapsed. The Great Depression wasn't just a financial crisis, it was a reckoning. And the reforms that came out of it, Social Security, labor protections, progressive taxation, estate taxes, were designed to prevent that kind of concentration from happening again. And they worked, at least partially. The kind of private palace that Harbor Hill represented became impossible to maintain, not because people stopped being wealthy. There are plenty of billionaires today, but because the mechanisms that made Harbor Hill possible no longer exist. You can't employ 126 people at below subsistence wages with no protections. You can't avoid estate taxes by passing a $400 million fortune directly to your children. The rules changed, and the palaces fell. But here's the uncomfortable question. Are we better off? The middle-class families living in the subdivision that used to be Harbor Hill, are their lives better than the lives of the servants who once worked there? Objectively, yes. They have labor protections, minimum wage laws, Social Security, health insurance. They own their homes. They have freedoms and securities that Margaret O'Sullivan and Thomas Chin never had. The demolition of Harbor Hill and the subdivision of its land represents a democratization of wealth, a redistribution, however small, of resources from the ultra-elite to the middle class. That's progress. But the billionaires of today have found new ways to concentrate wealth. They don't build 162-room mansions because they don't need to. They have private jets, private islands, yachts the size of city blocks. They don't employ 100 servants because they've outsourced that labor, made it invisible in a different way. The mechanisms of exploitation have changed, but the fundamental dynamic remains. A tiny elite controls staggering resources, and the people who produce the value, the workers, the laborers, the invisible hands, are still struggling. Harbor Hill was demolished, but the impulses that created it are alive and well. If you're still here at this point in the story, it's because something about this resonates. Maybe it's the injustice. Maybe it's the scale of the waste. Maybe it's the realization that the systems we live in today are descendants of the systems that built and destroyed Harbor Hill. Whatever it is, that recognition matters. These stories exist because people choose to engage with them, to think critically about history and about wealth. If this story made you think, let that be known. There's one more element to this story that needs to be told: the role of memory. History is not neutral. What gets remembered and what gets forgotten is a choice made by people with power. The Mackays wanted to be remembered as titans, as builders, as leaders, and in a way, they are. There are books, articles, historical records that preserve their names, but the servants, the workers, the invisible people who made Harbor Hill possible, their names are mostly lost. Not because they didn't matter, but because no one with power thought to write them down. This is true across history. We remember kings and generals and industrialists. We forget the soldiers, the workers, the servants. We remember the architects who designed the buildings, but not the laborers who built them. We remember the families who lived in the palaces, but not the people who cleaned them. And this erasure is not accidental. It's structural. The people with the power to record history are the people who benefit from the system, and they record the history that flatters them. But sometimes, if we dig deep enough, we can recover fragments: court records, employment logs, census data, gravestones. These fragments don't give us full stories, but they give us names, dates, hints of lives lived. And that matters, because every name recovered is an act of resistance against erasure. Every story told is a refusal to let the powerful control the narrative completely. Margaret O'Sullivan, Thomas Chin, the unnamed maid who faced the wall when the Mackays entered the room, the cook who prepared $1,000 meals, the stable hand who cared for the horses, the driver who waited for hours in the cold. These people existed, they mattered, and their labor built the Gilded Age as surely as the money did. So when we talk about Harbor Hill, let's not just talk about Clarence Mackay and his fortune. Let's talk about the people who made it possible. Let's ask who paid the cost. Let's remember that behind every palace is an army of invisible hands, and that when the palace falls, those hands are the first to be forgotten. The story of Harbor Hill ends in a quiet suburban neighborhood where children play in yards that were once part of a 650-acre estate. The grand staircase is gone. The ballroom is gone. The fireplaces, the tapestries, the stained glass, scattered, anonymous, divorced from their history. What remains is memory, fragile and contested, a historical marker, a few photographs, the memories of local historians who care enough to preserve the story, and us, we remain, the people who choose to remember, who choose to ask uncomfortable questions about wealth and labor and cost, who choose to tell the stories that the powerful would rather forget. Clarence Mackay stood on a hilltop in 1902 and believed he was building forever. He was wrong. He was wrong. But the question he was asking, how do I matter? How do I leave a mark? How do I prove I was here? That question is still alive. We all want to be remembered. We all want our lives to mean something. The tragedy is when we try to answer that question by building monuments on the backs of invisible people, when we buy immortality with other people's labor and suffering. Harbor Hill is gone. But the question remains, what are we building and who is paying for it? If this story stays with you, if it made you see history differently, share it. Not because I'm asking, but because these questions deserve to be asked by more people. Who gets remembered? Who gets erased? And what does that say about the world we've built? The gates closed, the money vanished, silence, but the questions echo.